The Chinese built one of the oldest civilizations in history and lived as a closed society for hundreds of years, stubbornly defending their traditions and culture. In the 19th century, however, China began to open its doors to the outside world. It was the Europeans who came through those doors, particularly the British. The Europeans came to China for commercial reasons and began bringing their own culture to the country. Alongside Western culture, Western ideas also arrived. One of these ideas was Darwin's theory of evolution. In 1805, 36 years after its publication, Darwin's The Origin of Species was translated into Chinese, and in a short space of time became very popular among the country's intellectuals. Books by other evolutionary theoreticians who supported Darwin's views also began to spread through the country. These included Thomas Huxley, considered Darwin's most fervent supporter, and for that reason known as Darwin's bulldog. Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, the founder of the theory of eugenics and a prominent racist. The social Darwinist Herbert Spencer, who applied Darwin's theory of evolution to the social sciences. The common feature of these thinkers was their belief that man and all living things were in a constant state of conflict, and that it was this which allowed them to evolve. Denied creation, saying that man had emerged by chance, and portraying him as a species of animal with no divine responsibility. The spread of Darwinist thought through society in this way led to social turmoil, unrest, and conflict in China, just as it did in other countries. Darwinism had such an enormous Harvard University historian James Reeve Pusey wrote a book on China and Charles Darwin. According to Pusey's account, Darwinism had a profound effect on Chinese intellectuals, encouraged them to adopt a revolutionary worldview, and provided major ideological support for the development of the communist movement in the country. The man who directed the course of the change that began with Darwinism was Mao Zedong. Mao's political ideology took shape during his student years in the early 1920s. His greatest inspiration was Chiang Kai-shek, the General Secretary of the Communist Party whom he met in Shanghai. Kai-shek's principal characteristic was his devotion to Darwinism. He taught Mao both Marxism and Darwinism. In his memoirs, written years later, Mao said, "Nobody influenced me as much as Chiang Dixu." The young Mao quickly came to prominence with the Communist Party, assuming the leadership from the 1920s. Communist guerrillas led by Mao began a long war against the central government led by Czech, who had also been influenced by Darwinism. The difference between them was that Mao was a communist and Chiang Kai-shek a fascist. During the Second World War, Mao's and Czech's forces formed a temporary alliance to fight the Japanese occupation, but began fighting each other again as soon as the war was over. During the conflict between the two Darwinist ideologies, hundreds of thousands of innocent people were killed. The Communist Party flag that was raised over the walls of Beijing represented an even darker time for the people of China, a land that was already in chaos. Mao's rule opened with a huge display. Crowds gathered under the red flags in Tiananmen Square applauded communism. Mao then set out the promises of communism in a frightening, high-pitched voice. Yet most of those who so happily cheered Mao were soon to become the victims of his savagery. In the first years of the communist regime, China's most important supporter was the Soviet Union. Stalin, the bloody dictator in Moscow, regarded Mao as both an ally and a personal friend. Mao now took his place alongside Stalin at the latter's show rallies. The first bloody cooperation between the two communist dictators came just after Mao's revolution, in Korea in 1950. Acting with Chinese and Soviet support, Communist North Korea suddenly attacked the occupied South Korea. United Nations forces were sent in to balance the situation, although the war lasted for 3 years and cost the lives of more than 3 million people. Some even tried to demonstrate quotas by replanting harvested crops in the inspection field. Led to false statistics, which in turn gave rise to even Communist Party declared a larger stock of rice and grain than it needed. To give price were therefore removed from the field and set to work on the construction of a giant canal. These villagers were portrayed as happy, although in fact they were doomed to suffer a terrible moral. Tens of thousands of people died as a result of industrial accidents in the hazardous conditions. With crude calculation that every worker will build one mile, the project will end in 3 months. Finish the canal. Forward, factory workers were doubled. On top, they were not stopped for maintenance and repairs. So soon began to fall apart. The room. Mao announced another target for the Great Forward. Steel production will be doubled within 1 year. Production will come not only from heavy industry complexes, but also from small businesses and villages. Ideology, Mao believed that workers' power with tens of millions of Chinese set out to produce steel by everything made of from doorknobs to saucepans was melted down in primitive furnaces in an effort to produce steel. Mixed with the furnaces. Forests were plundered to provide enough wood for people living in the city. Even doctors, for instance, joined in the steel production outside normal working hours. The whole campaign, the Chinese were simply producing steel, but not making what is more produced was of such poor quality that it served absolutely no purpose. Emerged in 1959. While villagers were working on building canals, the fields were left empty. Five figures showed huge production, although there was famine started within a few months. The situation of drought, the worst famine in the history of mankind. People starved to death in 2 years. Mao's Seen throughout this film what a ruthless and cruel system communism rules. Another fact that needs to be made clear is the unintelligent thinking. The so-called Reconstruction Project that Mao called great is a clear example of this. The Great Leap Forward shows that these communists bear no relation to the real world, and that the guide communist theoreticians such as Marx, Lenin, and Mao supposedly clever. The Chinese army directly entered the war on the side of North Korea, while the Soviets provided arms and equipment. Units that fought in the Korean War on the United Nations side lost 700 men. One of the bloodiest conflicts in history, Mao became more affairs, and millions were made to listen to his speeches over loudspeakers. And regenerating in those addresses, and say Marxism-Leninism. Stalin, Mao wished to implement a ruthless collective confiscate private property. That this measure would allegedly bring to the Chinese people. The Chinese put on false displays of joy. Women also appeared in the same false images of brought people fear, not joy. People were tried in the People's Court set up in Mao's first years in power and condemned. Would be leap forward. The majority of the population were living working in harsh conditions in the field and barely producing enough to feed themselves. But at least they did have the economic program known as the Great Leap Forward begun by Mao and complete the slogan of doubling China's industrial and agricultural production. Western countries would be of notice. As a leader who would solve all problems by implementing society. First collectivized. Individual production. The huge community consisting of thousands of people and forced to engage in collective production under military. Mao would frequently fields and inspect the villages. Communist Party initiated a campaign aimed at ridding the whole of animals thought to damage produce. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese set about donating them with stones and guns. Those bringing sparrows were praised as model communists. Yet this campaign to a party failed to succeed. The reduction of sparrows led to a huge rise in the insects. Sparrows had formed a fed up. These insects caused much more harm to the country's produce. In 1988, competitions were held between communities. The amount of produce from each commune was measured, and those who produced the most were held up as samples. At the following harvest, they announced they had succeeded, but the statistics were false. Communes reported the impression had produced more. Are in fact nothing more than empty nonsense. Communists believed in a mistaken ideology and inflicted terrible suffering on mankind by trying to impose that ideology on society. The irrational system established by communism is also a living manifestation of God's description of the deniers in the Quran as people who do not use. The senseless policies of the Communist Party were not the only reason for the famine during the Great Leap Forward. Mao and his supporters also regarded famine as a method of punishment. The regions worst affected by the famine were those cities and villagers regarded as not being sufficiently obedient to the communist regime. The party seized all the produce in such areas, and just as in Stalin's Russia, hid it in warehouses while deliberately leaving the villagers to starve. The reason the Chinese communists were able to be so ruthless was the result of the way they regarded man. Just as in Stalin, Mao regarded human beings as a species of animal and attached no value to them. That was a natural consequence of the Darwinism he had imbibed in his youth. When he said, "The basis of Chinese socialism rests on Darwin and his theory of evolution," Mao was actually clarifying the basis of the savagery he implemented. Mao's Darwinist philosophy has been described by the Harvard University historian James Reeves Pusey in these terms. The thought of Mao Zedong was and remains a powerful mixture of Darwinian ironies and contradictions. Mao Zedong, in an angry moment, as late as 1964, swore that all demons shall be annihilated. He dehumanized his enemies, partly in traditional hyperbole, partly in social Darwinian realism. Like the anarchists, he saw reactionaries as evolutionary throwbacks, who deserved extinction. The people's enemies were non-people, and they did not deserve to be treated as people. The Muslim Uyghur Turks of East Turkestan headed the list of those who suffered Mao's cruelty. With its long-term policy of genocide in East Turkestan, the communist regime ruthlessly slaughtered millions of innocent people. As a result of the nuclear tests deliberately carried out in the region, tens of thousands of children were left handicapped. This policy of genocide, that has been identified by international organizations, is still going on today in all its ruthlessness. Following the disaster of the Great Leap Forward, Mao withdrew from the scene and went into a kind of seclusion. The running of the country was left to more moderate civil servants. The Chinese were able in part to return to normal life and have a sigh of relief. But Mao was planning new murders. He thought that communist ideology had not spread sufficiently in society and attributed the failure of the Great Leap Forward to that deficiency. Mao's supporters printed tens of millions of copies of his Little Red Book, consisting of some of his speeches. Known as the Great Helmsman, Mao re-emerged onto the scene in the second half of the 1960s. A display of swimming he gave in the Yangtze River demonstrated both his energy and his support. Mao first of all set about debasing classic Chinese arts for the ideological program he dreamed of. He wished to graft the ideas of violence and conflict, the basis of communism, onto society, and thought he could commence the process with opera. The traces of communist insanity could clearly be seen on the faces of the performers, who had been brainwashed by Maoist doctrines. A visit by Mao to the opera was the greatest honor imaginable for such fanatical supporters. Mao commenced his second leap in 1966. This was the great proletarian cultural revolution. Propaganda portraying Mao as a divine figure was put out in China. School children were made to learn his Little Red Book off by heart. His slogans were written on walls, and posters portrayed his literally superhuman being. The militants of the Cultural Revolution were young students known as Red Guards. On August 18, 1966, some 1 million Red Guards brainwashed with Mao's ideas came together in Tiananmen Square. They trampled each other in an effort to catch a glimpse of Mao's face. One was brought to Mao's side and shook his hand. Even if that was of little significance to Mao himself, it was a matter of the greatest significance to the girl and her friends, who all fell over themselves a hand that had been shaken by Mao. Mao set these brainwashed youngsters on society with the slogan, "Revolution is right." He ordered the Red Guards to humiliate teachers in schools, managers in state offices, or anyone else they saw as being in authority. Red Guards even detained Liu Shaokui, who bore the title of head of state, and inflicted all kinds of insults on him. Anyone was accused of not being a communist. He would be hauled up in front of the crowd and humiliated. People with humiliating paper hats and on them hung around their neck would be laughed and even beaten and tortured. Most were the Red would beat their own parents. They would stop to ask about passages from Mao's Little Red Book. More than 1 million people were killed away. One of the inhuman treatment meted out to university professors in the Cultural Revolution. Before news for story, they all wore gun caps and dirty brooms and on their backs. Were filled with rock. Finally, they all knelt down, burned, and begged Mao Zedong to pardon their crime. Beating and torture followed. I had never seen such torture before. Eating night and insects, being subjected to electric, being hanged like an aeroplane by the arm. The Red Guards also attacked war and the country was being drawn ever deeper into museums were ruined, books burned, after which it broke out between rival Red Guard tactics. Factories, schools, and hospitals stopped functioning. Mao had led a whole country to a state. Order was only restored by the army, and the Red Guards were the funeral lament the bloody decree of superior being. And preserved. Technology would survive, however, and continue to build up. Maoism is the very word version of communism. The interesting thing is that it struck not only China, but also other countries. When Sino-Soviet relations fell apart in the 1960s, Maoism found support in various countries as an alternative model of communism. Regimes based on Maoist principles were Albania, Korea, and Cambodia, and those regimes inflicted unimaginable suffering on people. Cambodian people in particular are a tale of savagery, unequal misery. Cambodia, Asian first began to feel the cold of communism in 1960s. At that time, North Vietnamese war had begun to cross the border and infiltrate Cambodia. In the 1970s, the country was drawn into civil conflict. Cambodia, known as the Khmer Rouge, began a bloody war with the government. Hard could be seen in the face. The Khmer Rouge led and came to power in 1975 when and saw the dawn of appalling terror. State employees were killed on the streets, filled with patrolling tanks. With Mao's slogan, "The way of communism is peasantry," report the entire population out of the cities and into the villages. emptied the threat of armed military, and hundreds of thousands of people were sent off to suffer and starve. Turned into terrible where people were worked to death for a handful of food or executed for no reason at all. But Cambodia was a target for the savagery. Their rounded up copies of the Quran and burned them, and killed some 10,000 Muslims, women and children. The regime not destroyed religion, but also the family. A communal form of living was established, and all families, children in the community were indoctrinated. The families were unnecessary and were taught to and Engel comments on the origin of the man, whom they regarded as a species of animal from age, had no need as religion, morality, or the family. The killing fields of the Khmer Rouge were set up in order to translate that superstition of Marx and Engels into law. In the guards could kill anyone that they had the slightest suspicion of. That first carried out by the bull. They began bags over people's heads, suffocating them. 9 million population were killed in that way. Skulls and bones of those murdered by the Khmer Rouge in Phnom Penh. Here, the fate of those whom the Khmer Rouge photographed before killed. Communism and materialist philosophy have inflicted on mankind. All God turn their back on morality and regard the world inflicted on mankind in the same manner. Is the truth in a verse of the Quran. In both because of what people's own hands have brought about, so the dump of what they have done, so that hopefully they will turn back. Communism reached its peak in the 1960s. The Soviet bloc were run by the communist regime in Moscow. In China, Mao had been deified and his ideology was portrayed as an infallible guide. Fidel Castro's regime ruled in Cuba. The communist guerrilla leader Che Guevara was attempting to organize guerrilla wars in Congo and Bolivia. Many other countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia were under the threat of communist terrorist organizations or communist regimes. During those years, communism also burst onto the scene in a totally unexpected place. Marxist ideology began to spread rapidly among young people in the West. The Marxist thinker Herbert Marcuse played a role in that phenomenon. Marcuse offered a new definition of the revolutionary class, described as the workers by Lenin and as the peasants by Mao, the young. That same Marcuse actually agreed with Lenin and Mao on one fundamental matter. That was the Darwinist dogma that conflict was the fundamental law of nature. Marcuse's belief in conflict turned the '68 generation out onto the streets. Young British people held protest rallies at which they shouted slogans in support of North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh. In Italy, leftist groups carried out acts of terrorism. The greatest explosion of violence in 1968 was in France. Firstly, Marxist students in Paris occupied their universities, and socialist slogans were shouted during the celebrations. Events began to grow when other leftist groups organized marches in support of the students. Marxist students tore cars apart and smashed streets and shops. In a matter of a few days, Paris turned into a war zone. The barbarity that marched under the red flag was only suppressed months later. The 1968 student incident spread to many other countries under a kind of domino effect, and each time it led to social conflict, acts of terrorism, and even civil war. Those young people, exasperated by the political and economic problems of their day, believed that communism offered a There was another important reason why the '68 generation got caught up in communist ideology. The education system that produced those young people gave them every detail of the basic philosophical training necessary for them to become communists. That was because Darwin's theory of evolution, which contains the basis of natural history for communism, as Karl Marx put it, was taught in schools as if it were a proven scientific fact. Young people who believed in Darwin's ideas that man was an animal that progressed through conflict were not slow to turn to terror and anarchy. We may recall that Darwin's theory of evolution prepared the ground for the development of Chinese communism, and that Mao's bloody regime arose from the ideological foundation of Darwinism. The entire picture reveals to us one very important fact. Communist ideology is the result of a worldview that regards man as a species of animal and believes that he progresses through conflict. If that worldview becomes prevalent in society, communism will inevitably ensue. When it finds an appropriate political and social climate, communism reorganizes itself and again begins shedding blood. The fact that the communist regimes in the Soviet us off our guard. Communism is still a threat to the world because the ideology's basic philosophy is still alive and well. As long as that basis, in other words, Darwinism and materialism, is still alive, communism will continue to represent a grave menace to man. That philosophical foundation, Darwinism and materialist philosophy in any case possess if they were true. People must understand that they are not animals who merely exist to fight with one another, but that they are honorable creatures who must live by the lights of that morality created and revealed by God. Once that truth has been grasped, both communism and the other ideologies that have brought disaster to mankind will disappear, and man will live in peace, security, and brotherhood.